The first time folks noticed her standing at that upstairs window, the wind was carrying winter's last breath across the plains, and the sky over Red Willow Ranch was the color of cold steel. She stood there with a lantern burning low beside her, eyes fixed on the southern trail that cut through sagebrush and sorrow alike. Every night she waited, just as he had asked her to, because before he rode out with frost clinging to his saddle and danger hanging off his shoulders, he had tipped his hat and said he would return with the spring. And in the West, a cowboy's word was meant to weigh more than gold, more than blood, more than the long stretch of lonely nights between. Her name was Clara May Whitaker, daughter of a cattleman who had lost more land than he cared to count, and sister to two brothers buried under wooden crosses beyond the creek. She had learned early that promises were fragile things, easily broken by bullets, bad luck, or the hunger of the frontier. Yet when Ethan Callahan rode into her life like a dust storm with kind eyes, she found herself believing in something softer than survival, something that whispered of green grass and warm rains instead of gunsmoke and grief. And so when he left in the heart of winter to track down the rustlers who had been stealing from every ranch from Red Willow to the border, she chose to believe he would return when the snow melted. Ethan was not the loudest man in a room, nor the quickest to draw unless forced, but he carried himself with the steady calm of someone who had faced death and decided it did not own him. He rode a black gelding named Mercy and wore a duster the color of desert sand. Clara had watched him many evenings from the porch as he fixed fences or mended harness, his hands rough, his smile rare but honest. When he finally spoke his heart beneath a sky heavy with stars, he did not kneel or recite poetry. He simply said, "Clara May, when the spring grass comes in, I'll come back for you, and we'll build something that lasts." And she had believed him with a certainty that frightened her. Winter had been merciless after he left. The wind clawed at the house like a living thing, and snow piled against the barn doors until the cattle bawled in complaint. Clara took on the ranch work alongside her aging father, rising before dawn, breaking ice in the troughs, counting the herd with numb fingers. All the while, she kept her gaze drifting to that southern trail whenever chores allowed, as if sheer will might pull him closer. The townsfolk in Dry Creek whispered kindly at first, saying Ethan was a good man and would keep his word. But whispers changed their tune as weeks stretched into months. By February, even the preacher at the small chapel began speaking gently of acceptance, of the Lord's mysterious plans and the way the West swallowed men whole. Clara listened with polite silence, but she did not move from her place at the window each night. The lantern flame flickered over her face, casting shadows that deepened the hollows beneath her eyes. Still, she waited, wrapping herself in the quilt her mother had sewn before fever took her, telling herself that snow could not last forever, that no storm was strong enough to bury a promise spoken under honest stars. There were nights when doubt crept in like a thief, slipping through the cracks of her resolve. On those nights, she remembered the way Ethan's jaw tightened when he spoke of the rustlers led by Silas Crow, a man with a scar down his cheek and a hatred for law that ran bone deep. Ethan had known the risk, and so had she, yet he rode anyway because someone had to stand between honest folk and men who thrived on fear. Clara would press her palm against the cold glass and whisper his name into the dark, as if the wind might carry it across miles of frozen earth. March arrived with muddy roads and the first brave shoots of green pushing through thawing soil. The cattle grew restless, sensing change in the air, and Clara's heart beat faster with every warmer breeze. She began to sweep the porch each morning, to set aside flour and sugar for a pie she planned to bake the day he returned, her faith turning practical, tangible, as though preparation itself could summon him home. Even her father, worn down by years and losses, started glancing toward the southern trail when he thought she was not looking. Hope, once planted, is hard to kill. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson, Clara saw a shape in the distance, a lone rider cresting the hill where winter had once ruled unchallenged. Her breath caught in her throat, the lantern trembling in her grasp. The figure moved slow but steady, horse and man outlined against the dying light. For a moment she dared not blink, afraid the vision might vanish like a mirage born of longing. Spring was whispering across the plains at last, and somewhere between fear and faith, Clara May Whitaker felt the fragile edge of a promise drawing near. The rider did not gallop like a hero charging home. He came slow, bent forward in the saddle as if the miles had carved themselves into his bones. Clara's heart pounded so loud she feared it might shatter the window glass. The black gelding beneath him moved with a weary but faithful stride, and even before she could see his face, she knew that horse. Mercy carried her hope across the last stretch of thawing earth. Clara did not wait for proof. She gathered her skirts and ran from the house, boots striking the porch steps hard enough to rattle the boards. The wind tasted different now, softer, scented faintly with new grass and distant rain, and as she ran she prayed she would not find a stranger wearing Ethan Callahan's coat. He looked up when he heard her call his name, and though his face was gaunt and shadowed by beard and fatigue, the eyes were the same steady grey that had once promised her spring. He slid from the saddle, slower than she remembered, one hand gripping the horn as if his strengths were measured and rationed. Clara reached him before he found his balance, her hands hovering uncertainly, afraid to touch and discover he was only a ghost, conjured by longing, but he was warm beneath her palms, solid and breathing, and when he managed a faint crooked smile she felt winter finally break inside her chest. Ethan did not speak at first. He only rested his forehead against hers as Mercy snorted softly beside them, the ranch quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle. Clara sensed the weight he carried even before she saw the dark stain along his coat. Blood dried into fabric, not fresh but not forgotten. Her joy tangled with fear. She drew back just enough to search his face for answers, and he gave her the smallest nod, as if to say he had survived what sought to end him. "I told you I'd come back with the spring," he murmured, voice rough as gravel, and though it sounded more like a vow wrestled from death than a boast, it was enough. They led him inside before her father could even reach the yard. Old Mr. Whitaker stopping short at the sight of the returning cowboy he had half believed buried somewhere beyond the border. There were no grand embraces, only a firm clasp of hands and a silent gratitude that needed no decoration. Clara fetched warm water and clean cloth, while her father unsaddled Mercy with careful hands. Ethan sank into a kitchen chair like a man who had been standing against the storm too long. When Clara peeled back his coat, she found a wound along his ribs, stitched crudely but healing, proof that someone had kept him alive long enough for him to finish the journey home. It took 2 days before Ethan could tell the full tale, and even then he spoke in pieces, like a man setting down heavy stones one at a time. Silas Crow and his gang had holed up near the canyon pass, stealing cattle and leaving ranches ruined in their wake. Ethan had tracked them through snow so deep it swallowed hoofprints, and through nights so cold breath froze in his beard. He had not ridden alone for long. A deputy from Dry Creek joined him for a spell, but that young man now lay beneath a cairn of rocks where the canyon narrowed, another casualty of a West that demanded payment in blood. The final confrontation came with the first hint of thaw. Gunfire cracking against canyon walls, while wind howled like something alive. Ethan spoke of it without flourish, how he faced Silas Crow beneath a sky-threatening rain, how words were exchanged, but peace was never truly an option between men walking opposite roads. Clara listened with hands clenched in her apron, imagining the smoke, the thunder of shots, the split second where a bullet could have stolen everything she had waited for. Silas Crow fell that day, and what remained of his gang scattered like frightened coyotes. But victory came at the price of Ethan's blood soaking into melting snow. A rancher's widow found him half-conscious near the pass, her husband once robbed by the same outlaws Ethan hunted. She tended his wound and gave him shelter while storms made travel impossible. Ethan stayed only long enough to stand without swaying, because every day he lingered felt like another promise delayed. Clara did not miss the quiet grief in his eyes when he spoke of that house, of the woman's strength and loneliness. The West was full of such stories, stitched together by loss and resilience. It reminded her that survival was never clean, and heroism rarely came without scars. As spring unfurled across Red Willow Ranch, grass thickened and calves were born beneath warming skies, yet shadows lingered in Ethan's posture, in the way his hand sometimes hovered near his side when a board slammed too loud. Clara noticed these things because waiting had sharpened her sight. She stood again at the window one evening, not out of doubt but out of habit. Watching him mend fence under a sky turning gold, he caught her gaze and tipped his hat, a silent reassurance that he was here in flesh and bone. Spring had indeed come with him, yet both of them knew the West did not surrender its storms, so and some promises, once tested, demand more than just returning home. Spring did not burst upon Red Willow Ranch in a single blaze of glory. It arrived careful and quiet, like a guest unsure of her welcome. The creek swelled with melted snow, cottonwoods unfurled pale green leaves, and the prairie began to breathe again after months of holding its lungs tight. Ethan worked from dawn to dusk, repairing what winter had bent and what rustlers had broken, each hammer strike a declaration that he meant to stay. Clara watched him with a tenderness sharpened by memory of empty horizons. She no longer feared he would vanish like a mirage, yet she understood how icily the West could change a man's direction. There were evenings when they sat side by side on the porch, boots resting on the railing, silence stretching easy between them. Ethan would speak of small things, the way Mercy favored her left hind leg after long rides, the pattern of stars above the south pasture, anything but the canyon and the gunfire that still echoed in his sleep. Clara did not press him. She had learned that healing, like spring, could not be forced. Instead, she placed her hand over his and let the warmth say what words could not. In those quiet moments, the promise he made felt less like a vow wrestled from danger and more like a seed finally taking root. Dry Creek took notice of his return. The townsfolk who once whispered doubt now offered nods of respect when he rode in for supplies. The blacksmith clapped him on the shoulder. The storekeeper extended credit without hesitation. Even the preacher who had gently prepared Clara for widowhood shook Ethan's hand a little longer than necessary, as though grateful to be wrong. But admiration did not rest easy on Ethan's shoulders. He was not a man who sought glory. He had ridden out because it was needed, and he had come back because he had given his word. Nothing more. One Sunday after service, beneath a sky so blue it felt freshly painted, Ethan walked Clara to the edge of town where wildflowers were beginning to scatter color across the fields. He removed his hat, a gesture that still carried weight in a place where manners were forged from hardship. "Clara May," he began, voice steady but low. "I told you I'd return with the spring, but I aim to stay for every season that follows." There was no crowd, no grand display, only wind stirring her hair and the distant sound of cattle lowing. She answered not with a speech but with a nod and tears she did not bother to hide, because sometimes the simplest promises are the strongest. They married at the ranch beneath cottonwoods that shimmered in the sunlight. Clara's father standing tall despite the years pressing upon him. Dry Creek gathered with pies and laughter, boots scuffing dust into celebration. Ethan wore a clean shirt and the same steady gaze he had carried through winter's wrath. When he took Clara's hands, the world seemed briefly hushed, as if the land itself paused to witness a promise fulfilled. It was not a grand affair by Eastern standards, but out here beneath endless sky, it felt vast and unbreakable. Life after vows proved less dramatic but no less meaningful. Fences still needed mending, storms still rolled in without warning, and calves still arrived at inconvenient hours. Ethan taught Clara how to read the clouds for signs of sudden rain. She taught him that strength could be quiet and steadfast rather than loud and defiant. Some nights he woke from dreams of the canyon, breath sharp, eyes scanning shadows, but she would draw him close and remind him that he was home, that Mercy rested in the barn and not on a frozen trail. Healing did not happen in a single sunrise, yet it happened all the same. The upstairs window where Clara once kept vigil no longer held a lantern each night. Its glass reflected warm lamplight from within rather than lonely hope cast outward. Sometimes she would stand there still, not to wait but to remember, to honor the girl who believed fiercely enough to outlast winter. Ethan would join her, arms circling her waist, and together they would watch the southern trail stretch quiet beneath moonlight. It was no longer a road of uncertainty, but simply a path through their land, and that change carried a peace deeper than words. Years later, when their own children asked why their mother smiled whenever spring returned, Clara would tell them of a season when the world seemed frozen and hope felt foolish. She would speak of a cowboy who rode into danger because it was right, and who rode home because he had promised. Ethan would listen from the doorway, hat in hand, eyes softer than they had been in youth. The West would always carry storms, and men would always face choices that test their courage. But on Red Willow Ranch, beneath skies that shifted from steel to gold, a promise once spoken had taken root and grown strong, and each spring thereafter was not a question of return, but a celebration of staying.